realize that these are pressing times and the NLAT just adds on to the uncertainty. So just as a small contribution from our side, we have asked Saumya Singh to guide you all with the strategies and help you all with the pattern and all. Saumya was CLAT and AILET rank 1 and is thus probably the best person ever. So best person ever with this task. So just on the housekeeping bit, I would request you all to keep yourself on the mute and raise your hand in case you have questions. So without taking much of your time, over to you, Saumya.
Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Saumya. I'm a second year at NLS, and today's session will primarily be about the strategy and what you can do in the last 3 days now leading up to NLAT. I'll start with the strategy then. I think compared to the previous pattern, which was a new CLAT pattern, now you have slight modifications here, which are primarily in the exam pattern itself. So instead of there being 150 questions, now you have only 40, which are 2 marks each. You also have for the first time a negative marking for not attempting questions, which is 0.25, and for getting them wrong, it's same 1/4 of the right answers. So that's that. So firstly, I'll say that since you can't this time come back to questions, it might for some people make more sense. For example, you might be thinking that you shouldn't leave buffer time anymore, because we tend to leave that kind of time for the end when we go back to questions and the questions which we can't do, but this time it's not really possible. But then still, I'd recommend that you do leave, at least you plan to leave around 5 minutes towards the end, so out of those 45, because you never know while doing the passages, the fourth passage that you do might be the toughest you've ever seen, and you might need that kind of buffer somewhere down the line. So it makes sense to, for example, plan to spare just 10 minutes for every passage and leave those 5 for a buffer. So firstly, that was about the buffer time. Secondly, about the attempting strategy itself, I'd say that, okay, you have just 4 passages now, which will be 10 questions each, and everything will be covered therein only. So I'd recommend that you spare like 2 to 3 minutes for the passage itself. Ideally, it should be 2 to 2.5, because since your pattern changed, mostly it has been about passages, and at least the sample paper passage wasn't too long. So I think it makes sense to do it in 2 to 2.5 minutes. Okay, I did receive a question that after, like, if the passage proves to be too difficult, how do we attempt the questions? So I'll just say that if the passage is too difficult, firstly, don't panic, because 4 out of those 10 questions will not be much connected to the passage. 2 will be GK and 2 will be maths. 6, yes, they will be on the passage, out of which the legal reasoning questions you might still be able to attempt. The English and logical reasoning ones will pose a problem. So in that case, you can still, on the passage itself, give a little more time. That's about the passage itself. After that, when you get to the questions, you might have to budget your time properly. So let's say for the GK questions, you shouldn't give more than 10 seconds. I mean, you either know the answer or you don't know the answer. So that's how it is. Still, it's not like you will definitely know the answer to every questions, especially since the paper did have some the sample paper did have some static GK questions this time, the latest one which was released. So it might, sometimes you might have to work with elimination, which is actually fine, and you should try to eliminate options. That's like the best way to do GK questions there is. I'll come to the part later about when you should attempt a question and with what degree of certainty and when you should leave it. That's for later. After math, I think for English questions, you should not give more than 1 to 1.5 minutes at max. So I'm giving a very wide range here. Like, there's a big difference between giving it 1 minute and 1.5 minutes in CLAT, where you just have 45. So I think this kind of time you will help you factor in even the most difficult of questions, because some of them might actually be very difficult. So that will work for that. For legal, I think again 1 to 1.5 minutes. But though in English you might want to even keep it under 1 minute if possible. Like the questions in the sample paper were pretty easy, the NLAT sample paper. So you even 1 minute might be a little too much for them. For legal, you might need that kind of time because you have a separate principle and then you have those facts and then you have to apply them. So closer to 1 minute or 1.5. Then for maths questions. So ideally, even in CLAT, the unchanged pattern and the changed pattern, I never recommended giving it more than a minute, like at max 75 seconds, because in maths questions, like firstly, you should never do the longer method. If there's any shorter method available, you should take it. And I think many of you might have had access to resources where you did find some uh, shorter methods for that. So it makes the best sense to apply them. For the sample paper questions, I will say that they were pretty long. I mean, one had everything about the odd days and the conversion rate and everything. So you had to give it a time. So for those questions, you might consider giving it a little more than a minute. But if you just can't make sense of it even after a minute, if you feel that you can't do it, then it's better to leave that question. And this applies in general to every question. I mean, if you just can't get a hold of it, then it's better to leave it than to spend all your time on it. But especially for maths questions, I guess you might want to keep it in mind. Then I think that's all about the time division. Logical reasoning, again, it depends on how the question itself is. Like some questions are pretty complex. For example, the question stems like assumptions in general are assumptions and conclusions are a little easier than some of the other topics you might see. At least they were for me, because again it depends on your strengths and weaknesses. So I did assumption questions pretty easily, especially the passage ones. So keep that in mind. Other than that, like it doesn't make sense to spend, for example, 2 minutes on a logical reasoning question. You will have a hang of it by 60 to 75 seconds. So this is a very general overall breakdown that I can give you. There might be some passages which might themselves want you to take, like need you to take 3 minutes to read. There might be some questions which might take you a little more time, so you will have to balance it at that moment itself. Like during the exam, you'll have to take the call whether this is a question you should be spending this kind of time on. So this, but broadly, this is a division you should keep in mind. And secondly, don't get attached to any question, because there is a tendency to do it. Like you might feel like if you've given a minute and a half to a question, you might feel like, why not give it another minute or another 30 seconds to just deal with it. Okay, I'll come to the questions in just a bit. So after I finish this first part about the general strategy, I think these are some things that you should keep in mind while attempting the questions themselves. And after this, I'll come to the negative marking after the questions, if any. Okay. I see a hand up. Could you unmute?
Actually, if I leave all of the maths question, then what?
So you ideally shouldn't leave the questions. So I said it in case you just can't figure it out after a minute or a minute and a half at maximum. So if you just can't figure it out, then it might make sense to leave it. Otherwise, I would recommend that you should try to solve maths question, because they do give you an advantage. So this is something I experienced in my CLAT as well, that and my AILET as well, that during giving, like scoring that additional 2-3 marks in maths might help you get a very, like, take your ranks up a lot, because maths is one section where many people just leave it. And even from those who don't leave it, like for my CLAT, it was like the average score was 16, 17, because my CLAT maths was very easy 2019. So even in that, if you could get something like 18.75 or 20, that would put you a lot above others.
Okay, so someone else had a question that what about making guesses? Like, should they make guesses this time?
Okay, yes. So that brings me to the second part of this strategy, that this time there is a penalty for not attempting questions, which is 0.25. So you might be tempted to attempt a lot more and maybe make random guesses, but don't do that. So ideally, I believe that this is my opinion that the strategy of attempting or leaving questions should remain the same, which for me was that okay, if I could by elimination, for example, in a GK question. So I also have a question in the private chat that okay, if the GK questions are tough like in the sample, should I take a guess or leave it? I'd say that if you can narrow down to two options in every question in general, like if you can narrow down to two options and you have a reasonable belief that okay, one of them might be the answer, then I suggest that you should go for it. Like don't hesitate in that. Even if you can narrow it down to three options and you are highly sure about one that okay, this is because many a times what happens especially in GK questions is that you might have seen the answer somewhere but you just can't say it for sure. If you do believe that okay, you saw this somewhere, then you should attempt it. Otherwise, you should never firstly take random guesses, even if there is a penalty for not attempting, because okay, I'll put it like this. For us, it was 0.25, like the negative was 0.25 out of 200 questions, 200 marks, which became 150 with the new pattern. But now there are just 80 marks and just 40 questions to score them. So, and 0.25 always makes a lot of difference. Like you might have seen the 2019 rank list. There were 30-40 ranks at one band range. There were 30-40 ranks that fluctuated with even a half mark or a 0.25 difference. So you should not, even if there is a penalty for not attempting, and the gap between attempting and getting it wrong is still 0.25, you should not attempt those questions if they are random guesses. If you have a gut instinct that okay, this is the answer, if you can narrow down the options and you feel that one is the answer, that's when you should mark them.
Okay, and the next question is that if what according to you should be the focus of people study in the last 2 days?
Okay, so broadly I'll put it this way that from my reading of the sample paper and whatever has been given on the portal, the syllabus itself is not substantially different from what happened in the new CLAT pattern. So you still have the same types of questions. In that case, like your practice from the new pattern will help you. So you don't need to, for example, do an entirely new topic. That's not something that you need to do. In the last 2-3 days, the general strategy remains that okay, you should revise current GK and some parts of static, which are the most important. So, like till the unchanged CLAT 2019 CLAT pattern, this is what I did for my CLAT. I just did current affairs, some parts of okay, some short maths formulae, and that was the 2-3 days. For you, I'll recommend that since the pattern just changed, if you are not familiar enough with this pattern, so if you are still not familiar with the idea of not being able to go back to questions, or for example, having this entire general scheme of having one passage and then 10 questions based on it, get familiar with that. So if you find sample questions around like um, from a coaching that you go to or wherever, so you should try to practice them. In general, get a hang of your strategy because, for example, I said many of us used to leave questions to come back in the end, but now we can't. So that's something you might need to get a little used to. So these are the two things. I mean, GK and something and getting familiar with the pattern. That's all. Okay, so coming back to some of the questions that came to me by mail. Uh, okay, this is a general one. How to decide which questions to leave and which to attempt. So this is again the general thing that I covered. Then okay, about the GK and QT sections in the sample paper. Okay, so I did notice that the GK questions in the sample paper were mostly static. Uh, One was a little connected to it, and Grameen Bank I don't think was very connected to the passage itself. So overall, if you want to go by the safer side, like firstly, this was just a sample of 10 questions which had 2 GK questions. So I'd say that it's not a very representative sample, you can say. This probably doesn't mean that your entire NLAT GK will be static. But still, like if you want to, especially when the other sections have the similar types of questions, and mostly I think in the change CLAT pattern, there were current GK questions only and static one or two here and there. So I'll say that, okay, don't stop studying current GK. And secondly, you can do some things about static, like I think on CLATGyan there are some compendiums which I did, which had some parts of one of these two questions, and it's very comprehensive in general. So you can look at that. Other than that, I think QT, yes, this time it was time taking. Like I mentioned, that one of those questions had pretty solid calculations for odd days, then for exchange value and everything. So in that case, this would be one of the cases where you might want to give more time to that particular question. Give it like 1 hour, 1 minute 15 seconds, or at maximum 1 minute 30 seconds. If you can, if like for example, you are able to do those English questions fast, so use that time for maths. So like this internal, within the passage, this internal redistribution has to keep happening. So that is something you have to do on the exam day. I just gave a very general overview of what you can do, how much you should ideally be giving, but internally you can manage it.
Yeah, so there's one more question about
Yeah.
the passage. So what are the important issues or topics which people can read up, or what possible issues could be asked in the passages? Like, is there a good chance it could be a socio-economic type passage, and what could be the preparation which someone can do?
Okay, so since they have to take out uh, all 5 types of questions from a single passage, I would say that it would be more of a socio-economic passage, in the sense that, okay, the sample paper had that the refugee crisis that happened. So something along those lines. So it will not be, for example, too technical, such that they can't frame a logical reasoning question out of it. You are better off reading upon issues such as, I'd say, CA and RC and the debate that happened around it, or Article 370 and everything that happened. Then some of the Supreme Court judgments, because Supreme Court judgments do provide a very good uh, like they provide a very good base for framing all sorts of questions. Legal, you obviously can frame. GK, even GK and maths might be a little bit tricky, but then still maths questions can be framed like out of most passages, except maybe the most technical ones, or the ones relating to science. So economics ones are definitely one of those you should do, and those which have an interface between like social issues and economics, then definitely. I think if I have to prioritize, I'd say that.
Okay, there's another question about math in specific. So the thing is, this time the math pattern is different from the usual CLAT and AILET pattern. So the 75 seconds time which you like talked about may not be possible. So what should people do with math if it's taking like, let's say, 90 seconds to attempt a question, or a bit more than usual? What should they deal with it?
Okay, so yeah, I didn't notice in the sample paper that those questions were on the trickier side. And that's why I, gave a kind of a range of 60 to 90 seconds. Because even for example, the questions that I practiced for my CLAT, some of them were of that level, like they required 4 levels of calculation. So that's why I said that, the internal redistribution has to keep happening, in the sense that you should, in that passage, for example, the other questions were pretty easy, like the English ones were pretty easy. So you should keep the time from there, like attempt them in 20 to 30 seconds, and then take that time to maths. So you can't go back and forth this time, but still, when you are attempting individual questions, you should keep that in mind and try to accommodate these things. And if a maths question is taking too long, like if it's taking you 2 minutes, if it has taken you 90 seconds and you just can't, still you are on the first level of calculation, or you just don't know how to do it, then it makes sense to leave it. Other than that, it also depends on the strength and weaknesses of a person. So if someone, for example, is very good at legal but not so at maths, you can give more time to maths and give only 40 seconds to legal. that all depends on you at the end. So this is a very broad range that I give.
Okay, and the next one is about in general. Again, I think you already mentioned this, but just many people want clarity on this because there is negative marking for not attempting a question also. How do you like suggest people to deal with that? Like, what is the ideal number of questions one should attempt, and so on?
So it depends on the paper, to be honest. But I can give a very broad thing about when you should leave a question. So as I mentioned that there is a gap of 0.25 between getting a question wrong and not attempting it. And secondly, this time you don't have the surety that there is no deduction if you don't attempt, because there is a deduction. At the same time, it's a deduction of, if you get it wrong, it's a deduction of 0.25 out of 80 and not 0.25 out of 200. So that actually will make a lot of difference. I mean, if you have seen your if your coachings, for example, somebody has conducted a mock test, even I think uh, the authorities are conducting some, if they have a rank list, you will notice how close the ranks are. Like on the same score you will have multiple people, and NLS will overall take only 120. So in that case, I'd say that still don't random guess, because there is a gap of 0.25 that you will get from getting the question wrong versus not attempting it. Don't random guess. If you are uh, reasonably sure of an option in GK or even in English, etc., if you think that okay, this is probably the answer or this is the answer I'd mark, go for it. Don't hold back on it. At the same time, don't random guess. And if you just don't know a question, if you don't have that, like some questions we know instinctively in GK, for example, we know that okay, this is something I read, though you can't place it, attempt it. If you just don't know it, don't attempt it. Like that's not a risk worth taking.
Okay, and about mock scores. So people are saying that the recent mock score suggests that around 62 or 65 should be your aim. But so what do you think you would suggest, because the number of seats are very less?
So again, I'll say that this is something I'm saying based on the past trend too. Though the pattern has changed, one thing remains the same, that the difficulty of the paper can vary a lot. So at the end, that depends on them. So there is no generalization that we could ever make in any CLAT about what score would be good. So for CLAT 2017, you had a 135 score as sufficient for NLS. 2017, 2018, again the same thing, a little higher. 2019, you had 166 point something. So this might even happen in NLAT, because they might make it very difficult, they might make it very easy, it might be somewhere in between. So I personally can't pinpoint a score you should aim for.
Okay, I think most of the questions have been answered. One last thing is, many people just want to know what to do in the last few days. So if you could just summarize with that and how to like overcome mental complexity and so on.
So about the strategy for the last 3 days, I'll just say that firstly, if you are still not sure of your strategy, in the sense that now you can't go back and forth, that's out of the question. But if you are still not sure about how much time you want to give to specific questions, like I gave a very broad thing, but if you are better at one section than others, and you can modify it for yourself, so do all that. Like decide that what the general rule for you will be, how you will attempt the paper, how you exactly you will decide when to attempt a question and when not to, because I gave very broad tips based on what worked for me, but a practice will help you decide if there is something else that you should be doing. So do that in the last 2-3 days. Ideally it should have been done much earlier, but then the exam itself was announced a few days ago, so not much could have been done. Secondly, revise GK. So if there is some part of GK that you think is very important, like the very important topics such as I mentioned CA and RC and Article 370, which have been in the news for much of the year. From the recent news, you have Prashant Bhushan's case, the entire thing about contempt of court and what he said. Focus on that. So this would be two things, strategy and GK. And thirdly, I'd say that this should be the time when you should also not just, for example, focus on studies 12 hours a day or 13 hours a day. Because doing that, especially on the last day, don't do that. Because doing that does pressurize you a lot. And when everything, I think a lot of things have happened this time which nobody could have foreseen and didn't happen to any of us. So from the pattern change, then the postponement, then NLAT was announced. So I think this should also be a time when you should be taking out some time to do the things you like. Say, for example, if you play some sport, then you could take some time out from the day to go and play that, or listen to music, or anything in general. So don't try to overdo it in the last 2 3 days. Just gain a familiarity with the pattern itself, which I think you all might have. Should it would have been possible to do even in the limited time that you have. You could have done something about like attempting some NLS, this NLAT sample questions or whatever. So you will have a decent idea of what's working for you. Just hone on that and do the CLAT like GK part. Other than that, I don't think there is much I can say.
If you wanna like for last time, just summarize on general strategy about time management, because people have doubts about how to divide time between questions.
Okay, so the very general thing is that maths, I'll say 1 to 1.5 minute. Exceptional situations like the current paper, you could make it 1.5 and 2 minutes, but then sort out time properly. You should take it out from somewhere else. In general, try to attempt each passage within 10 minutes. Still keep that buffer because you might need it if one passage proves to be extremely difficult. For legal questions, I guess 1 to 1.5 minutes should be enough. Subject to, of course, if it's too tough, then you might need to arrange it. This is a general caveat. Then English questions, 30 seconds to a minute, I think, because you don't have a separate principle and the facts to read. Same for your other questions. GK should be 10, like GK should be within 10 to 15 seconds. No point in keeping it long. Again, like this might vary as per your individual needs, and though you have not had too much like enough time to practice too many mocks of this pattern because it was announced very not much before the exam, in these 2 3 days gain a familiarity about the pattern itself. Try to practice as much as you can so that in this limited time you know that this is a strategy you want to go into the exam with. And other than that, just focus on the GK in these last 2 3 days and some parts of maths and the short formula if you want, because your CLAT knowledge will, new pattern CLAT knowledge will serve you well. I think that's mostly about what I said.
Okay, so if anyone has any different questions from what has been asked so far, just raise your hand in the next 10 seconds, and if there's anything else, we'll address it. Otherwise, we can conclude.
What would be the fighting score according to you?
Again, I'll say that at the end, there is no one fixed number that I can give you that, okay, if you score 60 in NLAT, you will definitely get here, because it varies on the paper. So that's why I pointed out the various CLAT examples too, because it has varied immensely over the years. If I had to like generalize based on that, those 10 sample questions, again, like I personally don't want to point out any specific number and like tell you that this would be a score that would get you into NLS, because there is a high possibility that it could be anything from, it could be in any range depending on the difficulty of the paper. You might have very difficult passages that land you in a score of 40 as a fighting score for NLS, or you might have very easy passages that might lead you to 75 being the, like not 75, that is too much, but 70 or 68, something like that being the cutoff. So there's no one number that I want to point out.
So I wanted to ask about the reliance one can place on mock scores. Like how much can you rely on mock scores? Is it actually
Okay, so talking just about NLAT, I'm not sure if you are talking about absolute mock scores in the sense of the number itself or the ranks that you get on coachings. So Could you clarify whether you're talking about the ranks or the scores themselves?
I think they're actually asking about scores.
Okay, scores themselves, fine. So, in general, I would not consider them important enough to decisively determine whether you will score well in the paper. So this is something that I have noticed over the years, that even people who don't seem to be scoring too well, for example, in mock tests, there is a possibility that they will get a very high score in CLAT and make the cut, because at the end of the day, it's as much about your previous practice and knowledge as it is about your mindset on that day. So this is more connected to ranks, which is why I asked that clarificatory question, that many a times you see that overall, for example, someone is coming in the top 20 of the coaching. So your rank is usually 1920 out of some 300 people. Still you get a very good rank in CLAT and now NLAT, and you get into NLS or any good college. So that does happen. So I won't place too much reliance on the rank itself, the coaching rank that you get. Marks you should rely on only as an indicator of where you are going wrong, right or wrong. So if you are consistently getting a low score in GK, you know that GK is something you need to work on. Other than that, I wouldn't rely on them or the ranks they get as a decisive indicator that you will do bad in a section on that day, because that section might turn out to be very easy on that day and you might lead to it. So they do play a part, but not too much.
Yeah, actually I wanted to ask you, till which time will you recommend reading GK? Till previous year, or we should read the more static version of that? That I wanted a clarification actually.
So usually it's a band of an year. So for CLAT 2019, I read GK from June 2018. For you, since CLAT is happening now, I would recommend from August mid. So August mid or August end if you just can't do August mid. The reason is that in August and the months after it, a lot of important things did happen. So you had the entire CA and RC movement after that, which lasted till like March, and which is a very important thing that you might definitely get a question on. Like that's something I want to place my money on, though ultimately nobody knows what will come. So I'd say August to September 2019 onwards, but do cover the important events that happened in August 2019 properly. The very important events, that is.
Yes. So I actually had a question, that is there any specific type of preparation that we need to do for NLAT, like certain types of topics or passages that we need to read, or like, and how is like the preparation of for NLAT going to be like a bit additional or different than the preparation for CLAT? Like what are the nuances different in the preparation strategy between CLAT and NLAT?
So going by the types of questions, I didn't find much difference, to be honest, between the new pattern and the NLAT. So you have the same types of questions you have in maths, in legal, like these are the things you have been doing for the past 5-6 months. So there is one addition though, which is static GK, which out of 2 questions, 2 were of static. Again, I don't believe 2 is a very representative sample of the paper itself, but then still you did have 2 static GK questions, so you can't take it lightly. In short, I'll just say that the preparation for the 4 sections that you've been doing till now will serve you well. Just do look at the 2 specific formulae that, like, look at the short tricks that apply. For example, the parts about odd days that were there in this CLAT pattern, you should know the basics of odd days and how to calculate and everything, though that's something that you will do. For GK, I recommend you find some online compendiums for static GK. So I read the CLATGyan ones, like I told you, it's a website by NALSA students. There are 4 to 5 compendiums on it, which are really good, and like those were the ones I relied on the most for static GK. And I think one of these 2 questions is definitely in them. So that's how, like, topic wise, I'll say that this is all.
I still have difficulty in solving economic passages.
So for economics passages, I'll just say that, okay, if you have difficulty in any one particular topical passage, like you mentioned economics, so if you find an economics passage in the paper, you might firstly, again, the same thing about there being out of those 10 questions, 4 will be the ones that you don't need to understand the passage too deeply for. GK questions you can do otherwise. Even maths questions, unless there is some reference from the passage itself and it's very intricately bound, I think you might be able to answer maths questions without referring too much to the passage. So there are just 6 questions that you definitely need the passage for. So don't like panic if you see any passage that you just can't understand or from a topic you don't understand too well. Secondly, I'll say give it a little more time. So this is an internal budgeting of time that you will have to do. So if you see, for example, the third passage as an economics passage, and you did the first and second passages within 10 minutes, you might want to give this one 12 to 13 minutes, the overall questions, and the passage you might give 3 to 4 minutes, more than what you did last time. So these are the only 2 things that can be done at this point, because 2 days before the exam, because now there's not enough time to understand, like completely practice a lot of passages. 2 things you can do is you can look at specific concepts that you can that are frequently involved. So in economics, for example, you should know the basics of GDP, not too complex, but you should know, okay, this is something like what exactly it means and what exactly it entails. So you will find these basics in any on any online portal also, and if you have static GK books, you can find some conceptual basics there. So I think these are the 3 things that you can do as of this point before the exam.
Yes. So I wanted to ask, like, I am actually facing some problem in economics passages, as you clearly mentioned, but I started reading Economic and Political Weekly from the 2 days. So, and I had another question, like I am not able to maintain accuracy above 70% in English, logical and legal. Plus I have a problem in QT. I am weak in QT. I have been practicing QT, but I have some problem with that. Plus GK is not my forte. So do I have any chance in CLAT or NLAT for that matter?
I'd say that you have a chance till the results are declared.
Okay.
I mean, as an exam, it's like CLAT and now NLAT, like they're very interesting exams in that way, because you can never be sure of your selection. That's for one. I don't think anyone was or should be. And secondly, you still have a fighting chance. So it has happened, like, for people who did not themselves expect to get into NLS, they just did, or for many other colleges also. So the people who themselves said that, okay, they were expecting something along the 8th or 9th college, they got the 3rd or 4th college. So that does happen. So I'd say that attempt the paper. If you attempt the paper coolly, I think you should not, you still have a chance till that day. So that's what I'll say.
Right, thank you. So I actually had 2 questions. So firstly, when like I would be solving the mocks to get a better score, like the questions which I would not know, of course I would leave it, and like the question I would not know would leave it. Now over here also, for unattempted question there would be a negative marking. So like in NLAT, how do I like increase my accuracy for getting more correct answers for a better score? And secondly, since like the pattern of legal questions changed this year onwards for both CLAT and NLAT, would you suggest any article reading on like how to improve like legal as such, like any online website reading for legal articles or something like the caselet based to deal with caselet based questions, because it's no more principle facts like used to come till 2019.
Yeah, so I think firstly, I'll take your legal question. So the legal questions that I have seen, like in that sample paper, they were similar. You are right in saying that they are not completely the same as those that used to come, because you don't have substantive law now. So it has happened in some CLAT sample papers that they have given a passage from torts, for example. But then still, I think there are some principle-based questions, like the second question in this sample paper, which is based on the interpretation of the term refugee and whether that person falls in that. And even the third question, like the two legal questions here are both principle-based. So for these, I'd say that the logic remains the same. That you can, if you want to, you can look at some previous year legal questions and how they work. Though personally, I believe that these 2 days are not sufficient to like completely change how you are at a particular section. So about the other types of questions in general, I'd say that okay, you should focus a little on legal based passages, like you said. You can read them on live law, you can read them on bar and bench, the judgments themselves. But ultimately, I think this is something you should best practice from mocks and practice papers. Not just NLAT ones, even CLAT ones might help you, because the pattern has not changed too much between NLAT and the new CLAT, at least. So practice those if you want to, and focus on why you are getting questions wrong. One common error I'll tell you is that when we have principles, and we almost like many times have two correct answers, which both are correct definitely, but one matches the principle. So you should always look for the language of the principle if it's the correct, if there are two correct answers. This is a general thing. Other than that, I don't think there is anything much to be done in 2 days. Okay, you still have your hand up, I think.
Oh, sorry, I'll lower it. I had a question for accuracy.
Yeah, about the accuracy. I'll say this is something that I followed in general, the things I told about how you should, when you should leave questions. So I'll say that in this time, in the last 2-3 days that you have, could you tell me a little more about the exact accuracy problem you are facing?
Yes. So the like accuracy problem in the sense like mostly in general knowledge, when the questions used to come like I'm not really that strong in GK, so I would leave a lot of questions because I knew if I would attempt them, then there would be negative marking of 0.25. So I would leave that, and when I would leave that, it would like lead to a better score than in the times when I would do guesswork about something that I wouldn't know, because general knowledge, there's a lot of scope from which the questions can come. So, but over here, similarly, general knowledge, if a question is asked and if I do not attempt it, for unattempted questions also, like there is negative marking and we cannot revisit a question. So in that case,
what should be done? Okay. Yeah. So firstly, I'll again say random attempting is never a good idea. And if you have a hunch about GK questions, so it's very difficult to put, but I'll just say that sometimes by your internal sense that, okay, this is something that I believe that this is the answer. Sometimes it's by elimination. So you definitely know that these 2-3 options are not the case. Sometimes there is just, after you narrow the questions down, if you have all the 4 options like still in the consideration, you can't eliminate, I don't recommend attempting it as a general rule. If you can narrow it down to 3 or 2 options and you have a general sense that, okay, this is the answer. In GK specifically, I'm talking since you asked about GK. So if you have that kind of sense, you should attempt it. So I know that there is a 0.5 negative marking for getting it wrong, but there, like in a pattern with +2 and -0.5, which used to be +1 and -0.25. I think there is worth in attempting it if you have a hunch. But then again, don't random guess. Just don't randomly do it, or even if you get down to 2 options, just don't randomly mark it. This is after factoring in this -0.25 that you have after the new pattern. So I think the general basics remain the same because it's 0.25 out of 80 here now. Okay, so if these are all the questions,
I think you've covered most of the questions. So if you want to add anything else, just say, otherwise we'll wrap up.
Yeah, so I mean, the only general thing that I can say is that I know this, it was a very sudden thing, this exam, and some important things did change, like the ability not to go back to the questions anymore once you've done them. So it will depend a lot on how much you are able to familiarize yourself with the pattern, and it will depend a lot on how cool you are during the exam. So, like I mentioned, even if you are not scoring very great in mocks, or even if you have not been able to prepare too well, you always have a chance as long as you are calm and collected. So I think this is something you should try to do in the last 2-3 days. I mean, I know it's been like a very sudden thing, but attempt that paper as a paper and calmly as best as you can. I think it will help a lot in boosting your chances. That's all.
Hi everyone. Okay, so this is just to give a vote of thanks. So I'm guessing all the questions are done and we'll wrap up for this session. So first off, thank you Saumya for like agreeing to do this at such short notice. I'm sure it was helpful to many people, and to everybody who stayed on till the end and like contributed with really good questions. Like thank you for making this session more lively and interactive. And all the best to everybody who's actually attempting NLAT. And I know that this is like a lot to digest in like a week before the exam, but hope this helped and hope you do a good job. All the best. Thank you.